Thank you very much for Chair for the floor. Good morning to everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the Academy, the organizers, its presidency, Chancellor Stefano Zamanni, for having chosen such an important topic for these 3 days of conversation, discussion, and work. And also thank them for taking the risk of giving me the floor. After these 2 days, and after yesterday the words of Pope Francis, it seems that we agree on at least 4 points. First, I would say that it seems to me that we agree on the sense of urgency inspired by the state of the world. But, as has been said yesterday, we have a big problem and we have small answers. This is the reason maybe why we are here. The second point I think on which we might agree is the feeling that there might be a window of opportunity. And this window of opportunity requires that we could or should be ready. So there is a kind of air of kairos around, not only in this setting, but also in other meetings and activities around the world. Third point, I think, on which we agree based on the previous discussion, is that we feel a kind of discomfort with our methodological tools, with our concepts that fail to fully capture the challenges and the realities that we are addressing. And finally, the fourth point on which I think we agree is that the title, the ambiguity of the title of this meeting, Changing Relations, is a double challenge. It is a challenge to diagnose, but it also a challenge to move forward, to act. So in order not to repeat what others have brilliantly said yesterday and the day before yesterday, I took some liberty with my paper, and the presentation here about the systemic transformation is more contextualized than the paper. It is more contextualized in the present state of the world economy, the post-financial crisis state of the world economy. I have had indeed the opportunity during the last decades to work on 2 systemic transformations. One, in the early 80s, this work started on what became later the collapse of the planned economies. And also at the Observatoire de la Finance, we started in early 90s to be concerned by the state of the world financial system and its relation to ethical world and to the real economy. So, based on these 2 experiences of recent history, it's important, I think, when we speak about systemic transformation, not to forget the context. Because the context provides us with an idea of what is new, the res novae, and of each period, and also there is an obligation to move from reality to concepts and then back to reality. So there is this presentation which is on the table, which I will follow now. And provided I know in which direction to direct it.
The down, I think this.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So I will go in 4 steps. The first 2 are about diagnosis, and the 2 others are about possible avenues for action. The phenomenon of financialization, it's a barbarian word, but it became now a widely used word. Financialization is the starting point. Then the undetected systemic transformation that was accompanying financialization, and then moving to the prospective or potentially prospective part of the talk is about the crisis and collapse in systemic terms and the common good as a window of opportunity. So we are all familiar with this 2 periods of the recent post-war Western history, and it's very important to say that it's a Western history. From just after the war to the mid-70s, the French economist Jean Fourastier coined the term Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years or golden years of capitalism. Everything was running from employment to growth to absence of deficits and so on and so on. But then something started with the Bretton Woods crisis, with the oil crisis and other crises, started to derail in mid-70s. But it was not a long-term crisis, and it started again to work. And this is what we call at the Observatoire start of the 3 euphoric decades of finance, so 3 decades of financial euphoria. So these 3 decades today are observed through many different figures, and I will not provide you with all the statistics. We can do it during the discussion if there is an interest. But the phenomenon or the process of financialization has a visible dimension and a less visible dimension. So let's start with the visible dimension, and there is a lot of statistics around that can be used to show that finance, its all possible, let's say, declination, grew exponentially during the 30 years, starting from the variety of assets, financial innovation, through the volumes, speed, and values of transactions, in all markets, regulated, non-regulated, etc., etc. Huge expansion of balance sheets of banks, insurance companies, but also, and it was more or less the point of their birth, of pension funds, new players in the financial world. Also, the weight, economic weight of financial sector expanded massively, doubled, or in some cases even tripled as a share of GDP. I'm speaking mainly of the Western economies, of course. The capitalization of stock markets all around the world, and the returns on financial assets, these returns all around the world again. And 2 other important elements. One, the blossoming deficits, because the deficit was not a problem, because there were plenty of money around, so the financing of deficits, and, which we still feel today, the addictive indebtedness, at least in the decade 2000-2010. Just to give you one figure, during this time, both in the US and in Europe, in the Eurozone, the debt, gross debt of all public debt, private debt, enterprise debt, grew by the amount that was 4 times the amount of growth of GDP. So if it's not addiction, I don't know what it is. I will not comment the figure that you have here, which shows the relationship between the real economy and the financial economy. We could come to this later on. But as I said in the beginning, there was a visible part and a less visible part of financialization. And I think it is important and inspirational to use the old framework of Aristotle, where he speaks about the multitude of causes. There is not only one direct cause on which, let's say, modern science is focusing, but there is a list of causes from formal to material to efficient, exemplary, final, and so on and so on. And if we use this kind of grid to understand the process of financialization, I think it might help. And yesterday, there was suggested that we need an agenda for moving forward. And I would suggest maybe to use this approach of multimodal causality to address, or to structure at least, this agenda. So what were the most subtle, not so visible causes? And each of these causes had its own temporality, so they were following another rhythm. But I think, first of all, and did not start in the 70s, the intellectual breakthrough of neoliberal mantra, distrust of any kind of state policy, the promise of trickle-down effect, and the growing trust, or even the blind trust, in an invisible, whatever it is, of the market, hand or spirit of the market. But, and this is where finance comes in, new scientific, and it put it in quote-unquote, breakthrough appeared in the early 70s, where many of us were achieving or starting their university degrees. Market finance provided a new horizon. It provided a new horizon in the sense that the constraints of, let's say, classical finance could be overcome simply because the market was there to share risk, to distribute risk, to generate new financial products that would allow, and this is almost a textual translation, quotation of one of the textbooks of the time, saying we can escape reality because we have financial techniques. So this new horizon is extremely important. Then this horizon appealed not only to professionals, but appealed to a large public. Discover the power of your money. It's one, I think, of an advertisement of one of the transition countries. Discover the power of your money. The money is going to work for you. Market finance and its professionals, its professors, articles, formulas will generate risk and return that you require, and you don't need to care. World will be riskless. Work will be we don't need work anymore. So the magic of compound interest will play forever, etc., etc. A lot of this was also somewhere incarnated in the promises of pension funds. But there was also a moral breakthrough, which is nicely, I think, identified with the Wall Street film, The Greed is Good of Gicco. Greed is good, and we have been speaking yesterday about the fable of the bees and so on and so on. So it has roots, but it became a social norm. And then, this is intellectual, but then it started to touch realities. The process of liberalization of financial, not only of trade, of course, it started well before, but capital flows, and what followed, internationalization of banks and of markets. Also regulatory breakthroughs related to the financial industry in the UK, in the US, and the major financial capitals. And all this happened when technology was progressing. We are going to have an interesting paper later today about technology as it stands today, but digitalization started well before. And of course it started in industries where information is the core, namely finance. So all this had consequences. Consequences because financial returns allowed wealth creators, quote-unquote wealth creators, to become bigger and bigger, more and more influential. It changed the social structure. We speak today of inequalities, and financial globalization had something to do. It changed power relation. We speak about revolving doors, regulatory capture, and things like this. It is all this were prepared in this cradle of causes that were less visible. So financialization is a complement, a twin, if you want, to globalization. What globalization did to space by reducing it to the place which is, by abolishing distance and creating a kind of unique space, I think financialization did it with time. I will come to this in 2 minutes. There is an illusion that we can trade on future and we can use the future for the sake of today. So these interrelated processes accelerated until 2007, when the momentum broke down. Before we go to the present situation, let's have a look at the systemic transformation. Because this systemic transformation was going on in the Western economies, and it is important to say that Eastern Europe, or at that time communist part of the world, went through a totally different path. It was not part of the play. So this is important also to maybe to understand the present situation. So what is a social system? Social system is something that is alive. And I like to speak in terms of organizing principle. At every moment in a social system, you can identify, I think, a kind of dominant organizing principle. But this organizing principle is seldom alone. It is in constant confrontation with alternative organizing principles. So the periods of stability, systemic stability as the one during systemic financial euphoria, was this moment where the coherence generated by the organizing principle was rather high, and the alternative organizing principles were not so powerful. So the process of affirmation of what we call the ethos of efficiency took 200 years, but its stabilization or its hegemony was achieved during the years of financial euphoria. It won, one could say, over alternative principles, solidarity, reciprocity, loyalty, but also brutal force. So there was a kind of middle ground. The consequence of it is that the space, social space, taking this society at large, the social space left to other logics or principles shrinked, and the financial efficiency logic became paramount. I prefer to speak here about competing logics rather than speak about spheres. It's not exactly the same approach, but I think it is something that allows also to address the challenge of the present workshop. So the search for returns, for opportunities, for risk mitigation, risk management, have found their way not only into finance, from which it started, I think, to the real economy, to the civil society, but also to private lives. So there was a kind of colonization, the word has been used previously, commodification, marketization, but all this has to do with the ethos of efficiency. And if you want to sum it up very clearly, very shortly, one should use these two terms of transactions and relations. We move from the world of relations into the world of transactions. And this is an important step, and of course in the room there are specialists of relations, Professor Donati, Zamani, and so on. So I just would mention the major differences which I see. So the ideal transaction is something that is instantaneous. It is self-contained, it is unique, it is a monad to some extent. It is equilibrated, it is contractual, objects are exchanged, the actors who exchange do not matter. It requires an external infrastructure of trust. Trust is not generated by transaction, it is generated by the institutions at large around. It is efficient in the sense of, in economic sense. The relation is something different. It is not only mean to an object, but it also has its own importance. It is a process. It has a duration. So there is a kind of common, whatever project, idea, objective somewhere. But also relation is a succession of disequilibria, a little bit like walking, is a succession of avoided falls. And what makes this dynamics is the element of gift and generosity. Because at every step, what makes the equilibrium possible, this equilibrium possible, is that somebody provides a little bit more than the other one. And this prepares the ground for the next step. So, referring to Caritas in Veritate, it's where I found the possibility of mixing or introducing the logic of generosity and gratuity into the economic life is exactly in relations. It is no way to have it in transactions, as at least in idle transactions. And also relation, because there is this element of gratuity, of things that are not optimalized yet, provides fecundity, preparing the future. The unexpected future, externalities of relations are often unexpected, surprising, nevertheless, they are there. So relations are also fragile, and what is also important, relations generate internally trust. So this is the crisis, but then there is a perspective of opportunity. 10 years down the road, we still are aiming, or the business world is aiming as business to return to business as usual. To some extent it's back, but there is concern, the harmony is not there, and we feel the tension. So possibly there is a window of opportunity to install within the system, and that means transformation, another logic. And this logic could take over progressively from the pure perspective of ethos of efficiency. So systems survive as long as the organizing principle or the dominant logic is able to fight off entropy. But it loses grip when it's challenged by another. So what happened since 2007 is that there was clearly a loss of grip of this dominant logic. It does not mean that another one came into the place of dominance, but nevertheless, the hegemony has been shaken. So we are not in the situation of systemic collapse, but we are somewhere at the crossroads between the transformation and the recovery. Transformation means alternative logics, and this has been shown in papers starting from paper of Father Scanone to the presentations of Father Otis, to what Leonardo Becchetti has shown yesterday, etc., etc. So we have to move somewhere and to help probably this movement, which is already on the way. I will skip this, we could come to this. This maybe just very briefly, these are the four confusions on which the ideological blindness was built. The first is the confusion between the reality and the virtuality, very clear in finance, but not only in finance. The confusion between future and the present. This is the core of financial speculation. The confusion between ends and means. The answer to the question of ends has been, according to the ethos of efficiency, evermore. And finally, the confusion between anonymous markets or subjectless systems and human persons. So is the reconciliation possible? There is a wonderful quote of François Pérou of the 40s. I let you discover this quote. He shows clearly that there will be a moment where capitalism will have serious problems because previous, pre-existent frames of reference, I would say ethical frames, moral frames of reference, would have been eroded by the success, material success of capitalism. And then he says, political leaders need a rare cool-headedness in their diagnosis and an exceptional energy in administering the treatment if they are to detect and ward off disalignment before it is too late. Urgency, and it was written in 48 or 47, just after the war. It applies perfectly to what we live together. So, common good and window of opportunity. Common good is a keystone, but as every keystone of at least Christian social teaching, only the builder knows what is the role of the keystone. It holds everything together. For a spectator, it's a point of convergence. It's a point of convergence of the principles of Christian social teaching that is developing through ages and centuries. So what are the ways out that we should take in order, the way out of the confusions, in order to come out of the cave of the blindness of ethos of efficiency? There are first, and some of them apply, let's say, to the structures, others to the spirit. If we go only for structures, we'll go for barbarianist approach. If we go only for spirit, we are on the road of angelism. Both of them, of course, are not equilibrated approaches. So restore the balance between relations and transactions. Not necessarily eradicate transactions, but restore the balance between relations and transactions in social system at large. Civil society is one gateway, solidarity economy, but not only. Also relations in business world as they existed in the 20s, 30s or 50s. Reduce the complexity of organizations and increase the autonomy of smaller actors. Revise fundamentally the anthropology, and also it has been discussed yesterday, the anthropology underlying management, economic and finance, textbook practice and so on. If we have had a place where ethos of efficiency has infiltrated our world, it was in academia, it was through schools, and we have, at least the university economic finance professors have a responsibility there. So recasting the system for the common good means that we have to move at three levels. At the macro level, escape the market state alternative by providing more space to solidarity in society without intermediation by market or state. And in society, I include also the familial sphere, which is not, I'm not sure is part of the civil economy sphere, but I think it's very important not to forget this. Increase viscosity in financial system, that's technical story, but I think the third point, bring ambivalence into the public debate. We have been, during the last decades, focused on one metrics of economic activity, GDP and employment figures. And we know the limits, but with these figures, these metrics, has to be complemented by something totally different. So we should have and help to develop a new dashboard with at least 3, if not 4, let's say, aggregates. One, the national accounts, they are very good for market activities. Then sustainability indicator or indicators, but not 220. I would say one if possible, but it requires work on metrics. Then an indicator of the quality of social fabric. And this is part of the society, solidarity, family sphere, social economy, and so on. And I think this is fundamental. Then the policymakers will be able to see, yes, this measure is increasing GDP, but is destroying environment, is destroying social fabric, or the other way around. So there will be trade-off, and these trade-offs could be addressed and discussed in the financial, in the political sphere. Meso level, reforming, transforming structures of scenes into structure for common good. So we have the negative, but we should develop the positive structures of common good, and these structures of common good run through corporations, through corporate culture, but they also run through smaller mesoeconomic organizations, what Ferry calls subjectless systems. Faceless systems have to disappear and leave the place to more human interactions, not to say relations. And finally, the micro level. The micro level, which is probably the most difficult because it calls up upon each of us. Here it is, a diagram that we use for assessing corporate culture. And you have 4 axes. You have 4 axes in the north, you have the concern for economic performance. To the west, you have the concern for conformity with rules and procedures, and all this part of the graph is what can be called the legal egoism of normal business. But we all know, and that's where the locus of efficiency is, but we all know that it is not enough. It is not enough in our lives, it is not enough in our business life, in finance, and or government. So the two other axes are to the east, the moral concern for the intrinsic quality of action. And this is something that calls to a professional deontology, but also to the moral compass of everyone. And then to the south, there is the concern for impact of third party. So 30 years of euphoria were totally in the yellow, and I think if you want to revamp the system and to accompany the ongoing or potential systemic transformation, we have absolutely at each level of the economic system, but not only economic, to bring strongly the two other dimensions, two other concerns that are here to the south and to the east. Thank you very much.